Hey everybody, this is a chapter from uh, Iring Fetscher's Marx and Marxism. Yeah, that's all. Sorry, I'm spacing out because I'm trying to plug my phone in because that's what I record these things on, and the battery is. I guess I should preface this that for some reason my allergies are being uncooperative today, so I'll be sneezing on it. Especially now that I've acknowledged it. Jesus Christ. Christ on the cross. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Christ on the cross, speaking of which, changes in the Marxist critique of religion. Introduction. Religion and Christianity in particular has been criticized by all Marxists, from Marx himself to those who subscribe to Marxist theories today, but this criticism has not always remained the same. It can be traced to widely varying intellectual attitudes and historico-social conditions and has undergone at least one radical change. Marx's critique of religion can be understood only against the background of Hegelian philosophy and Feuerbach's anthropology, both of which Marx's critique of religion contains in a, quote, sublimated end quote, form. However, the latter development owes more to the materialistic monism of the 19th century, Darwin, Hegel, and so forth, and to the philosophical requirements of a proletarian mass movement, than to the work of Karl Marx. Finally, in Lenin's critical statements on religion, we find a combination of the specifically Russian experience of a church which bowed to the wishes of the Tsarist autocracy, and traces of an aversion bordering on the pathological to theological spiritualism, which he confuses with religion as such. To misinterpretations which followers and opponents of Marxism offer in their examination of the Marxist critique of religion can generally be traced to the fact. So the misinterpretations which followers and opponents of Marxism offer in their examination of the Marxist critique of religion can generally be traced to the fact that the different forms of this critique of religion are confused and not correctly differentiated. Section 1. Hegel. Not only Marx but Feuerbach and of course the left-wing Hegelians were still influenced in their thinking by the philosophy of Hegel, even where they rebelled against their master. It is therefore impossible to understand and interpret their thought without going back to Hegel. However, one cannot do justice here to the varied aspects of the grandiose synthesis of Western thought which Hegel developed. For present purposes, it is sufficient to draw attention to some aspects of his philosophy of religion, in particular the systematic place which religion occupies in the context of Hegelian thought as a whole. Hegel sought repeatedly to redefine the systematic place of religion. In the final form of his philosophy, it appears as the second stage of the, quote, absolute spirit, end quote, as the manifestation of God for the men of a specific stage of their historical development. First, as the philosophy of religion understands world religion as a development which was necessary not only historically but at the same time rationally, leading from inadequate notions of God held by the Egyptians and so forth to the highest, quote, absolute religion, end quote, Christianity. So in the triadic structure of absolute spirit, religion appears as the second stage of the structure leading from art through religion to absolute knowledge, speculative science. Speculative wisdom offers an adequate concept of what is only imagined and felt in religion. Inadequate images disappear, and through dialectical thought the thinker himself participates in the self-thinking of the absolute, God, absolute spirit, therefore comes fully into his own only in the speculative thinker and completes the act of creation through him. I do not propose to reopen here the argument as to whether Hegel's system is, quote, pantheistic, end quote, or represents rather a legitimate form of mystic speculation on the Trinity. More important for an interpretation of Hegel's errors is the manner in which Hegel views the sphere of absolute spirit as a whole, and in particular religion as mediated with the socio-political area. In the dialectical mode of thought, absolute spirit is understood as the, quote, unity of the subjective and objective spirit, end quote. That means the dialectical unity of the spiritual and individual human being and the order of social and political life, equally spiritual and objectively rational, is represented. Classical art and classical art's climax in the polis, imagined. Religion, fucked up. In the dialectical mode of thought, absolute spirit is understood as the, quote, trinity, the, quote, unity of the subjective and objective spirit, end quote. That means the dialectic unity of the spiritual, individual human being and the order of social and political life, equally spiritual and objectively rational, is represented. Classical art and its climax in the polis, imagined. Religion, idea of the parish community, and last but not least, known in conceptual terms, absolute knowledge. Viewed in this light, absolute spirit seems to be added as an, quote, afterthought, end quote, to the reconciliation of the subjective, individual, and objective factors in the objectively reasonable state. However, this appearance is deceptive, since for Hegel the acceptance of a specific form of religion conversely conditions the actualization of a corresponding form of political community as the nations represent their God. So, quote, they are, end quote, and so the nations design their state. Quote, as a nation imagines God to be, so that nation imagines its relationship with God and that nation's that nation's own nature. Religion is therefore also the people's own concept of itself. The people's own concept of itself. A nation which considers nature to be that nation's God, cannot be a free nation, until it thinks of God as a spirit above nature, not until it thinks of God as a spirit above nature can the nation itself become spirit and free, end quote. According to Hegel, religion is therefore the, quote, basis, end quote, on which a superstructure dependent on and marked by this infrastructure is erected. Only with Christianity have free states become possible, because only in Christianity has the, quote, infinite right of the personality, end quote, been recognized, but it's only in, quote, Protestantism that this potential of Christianity is fully realized. However much Hegel celebrates monarchy as the highest form of constitutional development, it is equally clear that Hegel also opts for a post-revolutionary bourgeois state. The French Revolution is for Hegel a, quote, sublime dawn, end quote, but that French Revolution was doomed to fail because, quote, without reformation, end quote, the revolution cannot flourish and society is tossed backwards and forwards unredeemed between rebellion and restoration. Even without any clear and unambiguous statement to this effect, it can be assumed that Hegel viewed the English bourgeois revolution of the 17th century and the Prussian reforms which followed the French Revolution as more appropriate expressions of that process which transforms the Christian principle into social reality, and which the great French Revolution also wished to serve. Quote, religion must therefore be considered as necessarily turning into a constitution, secular government, and secular life, end quote. Hegel, Philosophy of World History. The actual appearance of the secular life to which religion leads is dependent on the specific concrete form which religion takes. With reference to the relevance, essence, and position of religion in real life, Hegelian philosophy leaves a number of open questions which are taken up again by the young Hegelians, as well as by Feuerbach and Marx. First, does religion have religion's own object? Does religion have religion's own object, differing from man in society, or is religion simply the objectified, quote, reified, end quote, form in which the unity of subjective and objective spirit appears to men, in which they imagine, feel, and, quote, understand, end quote, this unity at a particular place and time? Feuerbach takes up this open question in a critical spirit, seeing, as Feuerbach does, nothing more in religion than the objectified awareness which, quote, man, end quote, has of himself, and in theology and anthropology which misunderstands itself. Religion also becomes a point of departure for Marx, who, unlike Feuerbach, places emphasis on the historical and social, quote, mediation, end quote, of religious ideas and attributes the all-embracing, unifying function not to the individual, but to the society into which, as far as he is concerned, Hegel's objective spirit has been transformed. Secondly, does religious imagination have a value of religious imaginations of the religious imagination's own, differing from, quote, absolute knowledge, end quote, speculative wisdom, or is it simply to be accepted as a provisionally inevitable consequence of the deficient philosophical formation of the majority of men? The left-wing Hegelians, above all Bruno Bauer and Bruno Bauer's friends, adopt a critical attitude with regard to the elitist implications of Hegel's speculative philosophy. In his encyclopedia, Hegel stated, quote, the content of religion and philosophy is the same, end quote. But Hegel also said that religion was the form in which truth existed for all men. The form in which truth existed for all men. The left Hegelian theologians oppose this distinction between an exoteric form of truth accessible to all men and an esoteric form reserved for the philosopher, by demythologizing the imaginative content of theology and turning it into speculation. They hope to clear the path to a wisdom which would be accessible to all men. That Hegel in fact wished to distinguish between the perfect wisdom of an intellectual and the political elite and religious truth appearing in an adequate form might be deduced from a document written in Jena in 1805/1806 but not published until 1931/32. Here we read, quote, just as there should be a special form of jurisprudence, bracket, for the special classes of society, end bracket, there should also be, end bracket, a special science and religion, bracket, for the same classes, end bracket. In our states we have not yet reached this stage, end quote, Hegel. It remains open to question, of course, whether he did not mean these words in an ironical and polemical sense. New section. Feuerbach. The intention of Feuerbach's critical philosophy is to reduce theology and speculative philosophy to anthropology. Not only the religious consciousness, but the religious consciousness's sublimated philosophical form, Hegelian speculation, is to be unmasked as false consciousness. Physical real man appears on the other hand as the positive starting point, together with the I-thou relationship, and love is the fundamental social aspect. Positivism is chosen as the methodological principle. Quote, philosophy is the recognition of that which is. The highest law and the highest task of philosophy is to conceive of and recognize things and beings as they are, end quote. God and the object of theology, end quote, absolute spirit, end quote, the object of speculation, are conceived by Feuerbach as objectifications and projections of human characteristics into a reality which lies beyond that of the human individual. In the essence of Christianity, we read, quote, the object of man is nothing other than man's objective being itself, his objective being itself. As a man thinks and feels, so is his God. The consciousness of God is the self-consciousness of man. The consciousness of God is the self-consciousness of man. Knowledge of God is the self-knowledge of man. The knowledge of God is the self-knowledge of man. By his God you shall know man, and by man you shall know his God. Both are one, ... God is the revelation of man's inner being, the express self of man. Religion is the solemn uncovering of the hidden treasures of man, the confession of his innermost thoughts, the public acknowledgement of his secrets of love. The public acknowledgement of his secrets of love, end quote. Feuerbach. This is the conscious and exact reversal of the formula in which the speculative philosophy of Hegel had expressed the relationship between God's self-knowledge and man's consciousness of God. Feuerbach seeks the root of the specifically religious concept in the individual human psyche. Quote, as a man thinks and feels, so is his God, end quote. Feuerbach. But Feuerbach traces the fact that man bothers to imagine a God to the notion that the individual finds within himself characteristics which the individual can conceive of easily as being heightened to an infinite level, but which the individual knows cannot exist in himself in such a state of perfection. Quote, "The divine being is nothing other than the human being, freed from the restrictions of the individual. Freed from the restrictions of the individual. That is real physical man. That is real physical man. Objectified, that is, contemplated and revered as a different separate being, ... end quote, Feuerbach. Unable to attribute the highest conceivable level of perfection of knowledge, feeling, and will, all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, the human, quote, species, end quote, the religious individual projects these qualities onto an imaginary otherworldly being, which he calls God, and which he humbly begs for a share in the gifts endowed upon him. The same, quote, critical method, end quote, is also applied by Feuerbach to Hegel in tracing the latter's speculative notions back to hypostatized predicates. Quote, "The method of reformatory criticism of speculative philosophy itself does not differ from the method already used in the philosophy of religion. We again have only to make the predicate the subject, and thus as subject into the object and principle. That is, bring about a reversal of speculative philosophy to arrive at the pure unconcealed truth," end quote, Feuerbach. In Feuerbach's Provisional Theses of 1842, many aspects of the later Marx-Engels critique of religion are anticipated. The emphasis on the concrete and central reality of man, the, quote, transformation, end quote, of the predicates hypostatized in God, quote, back, end quote, into properties of man as a species being, the formula that, quote, thought springs from being, but being does not spring from thought, end quote, the synthesis of active, conscious, and passive emotional principles as the essence of the German and French character, and so forth. In the Essence of Christianity of 1841, we already find hints of a theory of the origin of religion which are reminiscent of Marx's famous remarks in the introduction to A Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Quote, "God is ... the echo of our cry for pain. The pain must be given expression involuntarily, and the artist takes up his lute to express his own pain in its notes. He calms his pain by listening to it and objectifying it. He lightens the burden which weighs on his heart by imparting it to the air and making his pain a general being ... This relieving of the heart, this divulging of the secret, this cry of pain from the soul is God. This cry of pain from the soul is God. God is a tear of love, shed in the depths of the soul over human misery. Quote, God is an unutterable sigh deep in the soul," end quote. Sebastian Frank von Werd. This is the most significant, deepest, and truest statement of Christian mysticism, end quote. I guess that's Feuerbach. Footnotes are a little difficult to follow here. I thought it might be Marx for a second, but I'm looking at the text and it looks like it says, like, this is similar to Marx. Strictly speaking, we therefore have two, quote, sources, end quote, from which religious ideas arise according to Feuerbach: an intellectual source which consists in the inability of the individual to attribute to himself the perfect human qualities of the infinitely self-perfecting human species, if he conceives them as extended to infinity, and which causes man to hypostatize from these predicates a being in a quote other world, end quote, as well as a source which is rooted in emotion, emotion, and consists in the inability to comfort oneself in any other way in the pain and misery which are bound up with human existence. The cause of this suffering is expressed in greater detail elsewhere when it is stated that, quote, under the pressure of life, particularly of bourgeois and political life, the positive wish arises for a better life after death, end quote, for which religion provides a supposed guarantee. The intellectual and emotional roots of belief in God therefore lie in knowledge of and suffering from the finite nature of individual human existence. As for the enlightened Feuerbach, criticism of religion is justified in that it enriches and frees man by divesting God of the human species falsely attributed to him. Like all other forms of Enlightenment thought, Feuerbach's philosophy believes that the act of liberation can be achieved by a simple change in consciousness, even if he occasionally speaks of, quote, practical experience, end quote. The synthesis propounded by Feuerbach is one of sensuous perception and conceptual thought, and not yet of consciousness and action, as with A. von Kieskovsky, Moses Hess, and Karl Marx. Section 3. Karl Marx. Marx starts out from the position of Feuerbach's critique of religion and considers it an established finding on which he immediately proceeds to build. While Feuerbach traces man's notion of God back to the thought and feeling of the individual, Marx now asks how men are conditioned to develop or adhere to religious concepts. While Feuerbach understood the awareness of God as man's self-awareness, Marx now investigates the nature of the man who is only able to develop his self-consciousness in this alienated way. The problem is carried one stage further. Quote, the foundation of irreligious criticism is that man makes religion, not that religion makes man, end quote. That quote is from Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. To that extent, Marx is in agreement with Feuerbach. He continues, quote, religion is indeed man's self-consciousness so long as man has not found himself or lost himself again. But man is not an abstract creature squatting outside the world. Man is the world of men, state, and society. Man is the world of men, state, and society. This state and his society produce religion and inverted awareness of the world. This state and this society produce religion and inverted awareness of the world, because they themselves represent an inverted world, end quote, Marx. This is the basic principle of the Marxist critique of religion. The state and society and the state and society's specific, imperfect, unjust, inhuman form produced through their own, quote, inversion, end quote, an inverted awareness in man of his own nature, which is religious consciousness. In other words, the emphasis has shifted from an enlightened critique of religion to a practical critique of the social and political conditions which give rise to the religious consciousness or maintain its existence. Religion is described as a, quote, moral sanction, end quote, solemn completion, end quote, and, quote, general provider of consolation and justification, end quote, for this world. Marx. In other words, it is an integral part of this bad inverted reality, not merely the inverted consciousness appropriate to that reality. It is necessary in order to console man faced with the evil in the world, and thus make this evil tolerable and indeed justify this evil's existence. Without religion, this world could not carry on, and for this reason it spontaneously springs up again and again out of the inhuman conditions of life. Religion is, however, still the better part of this evil entity, since, quote, religious misery is at one and the same time the expression of real misery and a protest against real misery. Religion is the sigh of the tormented creature. The heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless condition. Religion is the opium of the people, end quote. Marx. Rhetorical formulations such as these must be read carefully if we are to understand Marx correctly. The description of religion as the, quote, opium of the people, end quote, not an entirely original description at that, is the only image which has penetrated general consciousness, but it is far from being the most revealing. Religion is defined as the expression of the misery of the world, as the sigh of the, quote, tormented creature, end quote. We have already encountered this formulation in Feuerbach, who quotes Sebastian Frank von Wert, quote, God is an unutterable sigh from the bottom of the soul, end quote. Feuerbach. Oh no, Sebastian Frank von Wert. Wikipedia says Sebastian Frank lived from 1499 to 1543 and was a 16th century German freethinker, humanist, and radical reformer. But religion is also a protest. A protest against this misery. A protest which, in fact, in the Marxist view, remains vain and ineffectual because religion diverts attention from this world and focuses hope on the next. Only after describing the religious phenomena as a sign which stirs concern and protest which arouses sympathy does Marx criticize religion as a, quote, opium, end quote, that is, a drug which hallucinates and calms. Religion's narcotic effect is thought to reside in the fact that religion teaches men to accept misfortune on earth by letting men hope for transcendental happiness. This is what Marx means when he speaks of the, quote, spirit of a spiritless condition, end quote. Religion, therefore, appears the more spiritual and aesthetic, the more spiritless and ugly the material world proves to be, and more it forces the human soul toward a, quote, other world, end quote. At any rate, religion can make people content only in their illusory consciousness and not in any complete and real way. It is a drug which does not help to cure the sickness from which society and man both form a unit are suffering, but is simply able to relieve the pain. It therefore seems to Marx to be pointless and even inhuman simply to remove this analgesic from man, quite apart from the fact that any effort to do so would surely be in vain as long as the disease lasts. On the contrary, the aim must be to cure the disease itself and therefore make the opiate superfluous. Abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of men is the demand for their real happiness. The demand for their real happiness. The demand that illusions about their condition should be abandoned is equivalent to the demand that they abandon a condition which calls for illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore the embryonic criticism of this veil of tears of which religion is the halo. It is the immediate task of philosophy which stands in the service of history to unmask human self-alienation in its secular form, now that it has been unmasked in its sacred form. Thus criticism of heaven is transformed into the criticism of the earth, the criticism of religion into the criticism of law, the criticism of theology into the criticism of politics. End quote. The whole passage was a quote from, I didn't recognize it as a quote, but the last 6 sentences were a quote from Marx. Just as in a previous reference, Marx says that, quote, this state, and this society produce religion, end quote. In the sentence quoted last, Marx simply speaks of a criticism of law and politics. However, as is well known, Marx does not stop at this form of criticism. Marx tries instead to trace all forms of human self-alienation back to their roots, which Marx finds in alienated work and alienated social conditions in commodity-producing society. Law and the state then appear simply as derivative phenomena or, quote, superstructures, end quote, in regard to the alienated and alienating society. At the time when his introduction to a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right of 1843 was published, the critique of political economy first embarked upon in the Paris manuscripts of 1844 was not yet the center of Marx's interest. However, Marx already knew that the political emancipation of the bourgeois revolution had not yet brought about, nor could the political emancipation of the bourgeois revolution bring about that, quote, human liberation, end quote, which was its slogan and which Marx had espoused. Following on from the philosophy of Hess and perhaps also from certain ideas of August Graf von Kiszkowski. He had already set his hopes on a proletarian revolution and a combination of the German and French spirit. German philosophy and French socialism, as Feuerbach had done before him. Finally, in his early writings, Marx was concerned with a combination self-consciousness and historical practice which would truly, quote, transcend, end quote, all previous philosophy. In his first thesis on Feuerbach of 1845, he objects against all previous materialism, including that of Feuerbach, that, quote, reality and the sensible world are conceived only in the form of objects, or of contemplation, end quote. By contrast, he wishes to highlight in his own concept the, quote, sensuous human activity and practice, end quote, the subjective and active sides of reality. Quote, revolutionary and, quote, practical critical activity seem to him to represent the highest form of practical experience. In the revolutionary action of the proletariat, once it has been awakened to political self-awareness, the historical substance which Hegel could only understand in retrospect, would at the same time comprehend itself and act with corresponding consciousness. Here Marx hoped not only to contact, but also to penetrate that reality which had so far only been interpreted in many different ways by different philosophers. Quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in different ways. The point is to change it, end quote. The 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Feuerbach's synthesis of thought and contemplation is replaced by a synthesis of self-awareness and revolutionary activity. Quote, the fact that the secular basis of religion, separates itself from itself and establishes an independent realm for itself in the clouds can be explained only by the self-cleavage and self-contradictions of this secular basis. Therefore, the latter must be understood in its contradictions and revolutionized in practice, end quote. Fourth thesis on Feuerbach. Marx had already clearly seen the second of these two tasks in 1844. Radical human emancipation could only be brought about by a class, quote, with radical chains, end quote. That is the industrial proletariat, by whose action all men will be freed at the same time, because as a class it can only liberate itself by putting an end to every form of, quote, domination of man over man, end quote. Domination of man over men, end quote. End quote, exploitation of man by men, end quote. With the cancellation of these inhuman social conditions, the misery will disappear. That is, the misery which was necessarily expressed in religion and against which religion made an ineffectual protest. In his major works, Capital and Theories of Surplus Value, Marx examined further the self-contradiction of the secular basis of religion. That is, the antagonistic structure of society and the contradictory character of bourgeois political economy. The religious critique of the early writings is continued at least indirectly in the critique of political economy. The first chapter of Capital of 1867 contains the famous section on the, quote, fetish character of commodities and its mystery, end quote, in which direct reference is made to the problem of religious alienation. In a commodity-producing society, the relationships between individuals seem to depend on things, commodities and their laws of circulation, that is, on the market. A mysterious force transforms the products of human work, which have specific use values, into general, quote, commodities, end quote, gives them, quote, value, end quote, and makes them exchangeable for other equivalent commodities. Marx attempts to explain this mystery in the section referred to above. Quote, the mysterious nature of commodities consists simply in the fact that they reflect back to men the social character of men's own work as the objective character of the products of work themselves. That they reflect back to men the social character of their own work as the objective character of the products of work themselves, as the social, natural characteristics of these things, and therefore present the social relationship between producers and the producers' labor as a whole as a social relationship of objects consisting outside themselves. Through this quid pro quo, the products of labor become commodities. It is only the specific social relationship between men themselves which assumes here the phantasmagorical form of a relationship between things. To find an analogy, we must therefore fall back upon the nebulous region of the religious world. The nebulous region of the religious world. Here the products of the human brain seem to be independent things endowed with a life of their own and related to each other as well as to men. So it is with the products of human hands in the world of commodities. This I call the fetishism which attaches to the products of work as soon as the products of work are produced as commodities. This fetishism is therefore inseparable from commodity production. However, according to Marx, the fetish nature of the commodities and the attainment of independence by their, quote, world, end quote, in relations to the human beings who produce them, as isolated individuals determined by the division of labor, represents not only an analogy with religious alienation, but also forms the basis for the continuation of such alienation. As long as the social relationships between men appear to men as the relationships between alien things, commodities, so that their own society confronts them as a complex of objective relationships with their own immutable laws, they will not cease to posit a transcendental divine being beyond the society, just as they require a political power of the state to control and regulate it. If, however, the specific opacity of the manufacturing society is the cause of the religious alienation of contemporary man, the question must then arise as to how religious consciousness came about at much earlier stages of social development. At that time, the social bodies were simpler, more transparent, and more readily understandable. I don't know. That seems untrue. A religious society, which attributes power, say, to some kind of artifact or whatever that supposedly has special powers of some kind. I don't feel like that's a transparent society at all, but what do I know? At that time, the social bodies were simpler, more transparent, and more readily understandable. How then did men not break through to consciousness of themselves and of the social conditions of their own individuality? Quote, those old social organisms of production were far simpler and more transparent than the bourgeois form, but they were based either on the immaturity of the individual man, who has not yet cut the umbilical cord of natural association with others, or on direct relationships of domination and servitude. I don't know if I said quote. I gotta repeat that. Quote, those old social organisms of production were far simpler and more transparent than the bourgeois form, but they were based either on the immaturity of the individual man, who has not yet cut the umbilical cord of natural association with others, or on direct relationships of domination and servitude. Direct relationships of domination and servitude. They are conditioned by a lower stage of development of the productive forces of labor and correspondingly restricted relationships between men themselves. Restricted relationships between men themselves within their material sphere of life, and between men and nature. This actual restriction is reflected in ideal forms in the old natural and folk religions. ... End quote. Marx. Here then the religious consciousness is based on the fact that individuals are either still one with the natural community and have not yet developed an individual consciousness, or else live in direct relationships of domination and servitude, slavery, or serfdom. Both phenomena are in the last resort conditioned by the low level of development of human skills, tools, machines, and so forth. In modern bourgeois society, on the other hand, the self-conscious individual has become completely detached from the natural communities, refers back consciously to them, and the direct relationships of domination and servitude have been cancelled by the establishment of general equality before the law, contractual freedom. The old natural and folk religions have become impossible, and Christianity has taken their place. Quote, for a society of commodity producers whose general relations of social production consist in relating to their products as commodities, that is, as values, and relating their individual labor to one another in this subjective form as identical human work, Christianity, with its call of abstraction in man, in particular in its bourgeois development as Protestantism, in particular in its bourgeois development as Protestantism, deism, and so forth, is the most appropriate form of religion. End quote. Marx. The individualism of Protestant piety appears here as, quote, corresponding, end quote, to the individual mode of production and to the isolation of producers who are linked only by the market. As the church becomes invisible, society also becomes invisible and simply controls and directs individuals, quote, behind their backs, end quote, that is, through the market. Adam Smith's, quote, invisible hand, end quote, is evident in the frequently anonymous, quote, providence, end quote, of contemporary theology. Karl Marx was aware of certain connections between Protestantism and the, quote, spirit of capitalism, end quote, long before Max Weber, and Marx did not, as might be assumed, posit a monocausal relationship between capitalism and Protestantism, but simply characterized, quote, Protestantism, deism, and so forth, end quote, as the forms of religion, quote, corresponding to, end quote, capitalist manufacturing society. If you think of something, one of the errors is bad interpretations of evolution, right? Is like functional explanations of evolution, right? Which take out the role of chance and contingency in evolution and think that, like, I don't know, because trees are high, giraffes are automatically going to grow long necks. It's a kind of like a Lamarckian teleological conception of evolution. Protestantism could be viewed in that way, right? If someone's views as Protestantism as like the religion functional to a capitalist society, even if it is indeed functional, that does not mean that its genesis and its spread its genesis stems out of it being functional for capitalist society, if that makes sense, right? So one of the conditions for Protestantism spreading might be might be capitalist in character, right? The capitalist conditions make Protestantism, most if Protestantism corresponds most to this mode of production that's developing, that doesn't mean that Protestantism emerged because of capitalism in some necessary sense, right? Like, of course, Protestantism came to be. So if you take an analogy like the giraffe's neck that we were speaking of before, like the giraffe's neck, the genetic advantage of a long neck that would make survival in an environment of tall trees easier. Isn't what caused the giraffe's neck to grow from generation to generation, or like the growth of the mutation that caused the species that will become giraffes, or maybe giraffe's neck to extend. What caused it was a random mutation that strictly was able to survive. It wasn't so damning that it wasn't so subversive, such a subversive mutation that it couldn't spread, and over time it came to you kind of have this this thing where it's like this functioning. The giraffe's neck is functional for its position for what it needs to survive, but what caused that is not some kind of they might they're functional for each other, but that doesn't uh, explain their genesis, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Any hooser. I'll repeat that last sentence and maybe what I just said will make more sense. Karl Marx was aware of certain connections between Protestantism and the, quote, spirit of capitalism, end quote, long before Max Weber, and Marx did not, as might be assumed, posit a monocausal relationship between capitalism and Protestantism, but simply characterized, quote, Protestantism, deism, and so forth, end quote, as the forms of religion, quote, corresponding to, end quote, capitalist manufacturing society. The abolition of religion is expected to result, according to Capital, from a transformation of the mode of production, which will make relationships between men both, quote, transparent, end quote, reasonable, end quote, by which is meant free relationships determined solely by technical tasks and individual insight. The, quote, religious reflection of technical tasks, quote, the religious reflection of the real world can, only disappear when the relationships of practical daily life become for men wholly intelligible and reasonable relationships between men and between men and nature. Wholly intelligible and reasonable relationships between men and between men and nature. The form of the social process of life, that is, of the material process of production, will only lose its mystic veil when it is the product of freely associated men under their conscious and purposive control, end quote. Marx. A mystique of revolutionary and at the same time, quote, self-conscious, end quote, action is replaced here by a sketch of a social order in which the relationships between men and between men and nature are clearly intelligible and acceptable as rational. In a society such as this, which Marx believes can only come about if individuals associate of their own free will to assume the control of production and distribution, the, quote, religious reflection of the world, end quote, would disappear. The task, therefore, is not to combat religion, but, now more expressly than before, to bring about a society which will allow the religious consciousness to wither away. Pain and misery which Feuerbach saw as the origin of religion are now specified as the suffering resulting from enforced, irrational, and alien conditions of life, social structures. The emphasis has shifted from emotional to intellectual suffering, but without losing sight of the reality of that suffering. The formula in which Marx indicates the free society of the future is more moderate than his, quote, excerpt notes, unquote, of the 1840s, but it nevertheless seems justifiable to refer to it, since it is here that Marx demonstrates most cogently that, quote, religious inspiration, end quote, will be made superfluous by the founding of a, quote, humane society, end quote. The luminous image of this society was the driving force behind the scientific and political effort of Karl Marx. Quote, assuming that we are producers as human beings, bracket, not as isolated producers of commodities, Iring Fetscher, end bracket, each of us would then have doubly asserted himself and others through his production. 1. In my production I would have objectified my individuality, in my individuality's uniqueness, 2. In your enjoyment or use of my product I would have had the direct satisfaction of the awareness that I had satisfied a human need through my work and of having expressed human nature objectively, 3. I would have had the satisfaction of having acted as the mediator between you and the human species, that is, recognized and felt by you to be a complement of your own being and a necessary part of yourself, and thus I would have received the confirmation of my own existence in your thought and in your love. Our products would then be so many mirrors from which our being would shine out to us, end quote. Marx. The conviction of Karl Marx that humanity was always to be interpreted as the, quote, creator of humanity's self, end quote, as the, quote, creator of itself, end quote, becomes fully conscious and clear for the first time for the individual members of a perfect human society related together by love. Individuals would then no longer require a special mediator to form a bond with the species or with God, the corresponding reflection of the species, into another world. To one another they are both ends and mediators, and not simply, quote, means, end quote, to be used for selfish ends. The humane society of social men has replaced God and the notion of divine perfection. Section 4, From Engels to Lenin. Section 4, From Engels to Lenin, the metamorphosis of Marxism into a, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, end quote. In Friedrich Engels we find, in addition to Marx's theses on the criticism of religion, a number of arguments taken from contemporary positivist and materialist philosophy. This, quote, complement, end quote, corresponds, however, to the increasing displacement of activity of the workers' movement. The stress is no longer on the critique of political economy and the hope of revolutionary action, but on a proletarian Weltanschauung and the strengthening and maintenance of the organization, party. With the consolidation of proletarian socialist party containing millions of members and the failure of the revolution to materialize, the need to consolidate organizational unity in, quote, philosophical, end quote, terms become greater. The longer the revolution was delayed, the more important it seemed to the party leaders to demarcate the boundaries with the bourgeoisie milieu through their own specific philosophy. This philosophy is, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, in which elements of Hegelian dialectics are combined with the materialistic evolutionary theory of Hegel and others. The fact that in content, this philosophy hardly differed from the, quote, bourgeois, end quote, philosophies of the same age is hardly realized by Engels and his, quote, heirs, end quote, Kautsky and Lenin. The social conflict between the bourgeoisie and proletariat is transferred to the philosophical conflict between idealism and materialism. The now conservative bourgeoisie counts as idealistic and, at least externally, religious. By conversion to irreligious dialectical materialism, it is therefore possible for individuals from other social strata to show their association with the Marxist workers' movement. In earlier stages of history, the bourgeoisie was, as Engels recognized, materialistic and atheistic in the bourgeoisie's outlook, or at least deistic, which, according to Engels, is equivalent to an ashamed and cautious form of atheism. The revolutionary Marxist workers' movement is therefore here as well the, quote, heir, end quote, of the, quote, progressive traits, end quote, of the earlier bourgeoisie. The emphasis shifts from criticism and revolutionary practice to philosophy and organization. In his preliminary notes for Anti-Düring of 1878, Engels noted, for example, quote, even the correct reflection of nature. The correct reflection of nature is extremely difficult and the product of long experience. The natural forces are something alien, mysterious, and superior to primitive man. At a certain stage in his development, which all civilized peoples pass through, he assimilates them by personification, the natural forces. This drive towards personification creates gods everywhere, and the consensus gentium of the evidence for the existence of God simply proves the universality of this urge to personification as a necessary transitional stage. A necessary transitional stage, hence of religion too. Only a true understanding of natural forces drives gods or God out of one position after another, end quote. Engels. This notion coincides almost entirely with that of Auguste Comte and his theory of the three stages. Religious consciousness is interpreted as a primitive form of knowledge which, in accordance with the progress of natural science, is first monotheistic, then metaphysical, and finally disappears altogether. In the introduction to his Anti-Düring, Engels, virtually following Comte, establishes the superfluity of a, quote, philosophy raised above other sciences, end quote. Quote, as soon as each individual science is required to clarify its position in the general context of and the knowledge of things, any special science of this totality is superfluous. What then independently survives of all previous philosophy is the theory of thought and its law, formal logic and dialectics. Everything else is merged in the positive science of nature and history. Everything else is merged in the positive science of nature and history, end quote. Engels. Anti-Durham. In the religious critique of Engels and later Marxism, a positivist attitude is interlaced with philosophical polemics. Whereas from the standpoint of positivist faith in science, religion becomes unnecessary through the development of the positive sciences, it is an inimical Weltanschauung from the materialistic standpoint. The assertion that, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, is a, quote, scientific philosophy, end quote, combines these two essentially contradictory statements. Engels had already seen religion as a form of, quote, idealism, end quote, or dualism to which materialistic monism is opposed. Through the progress of the sciences, Engels believes also that it is possible to retrieve the, quote, that, quote, unity between man and nature, end quote, which have been lost in religion and philosophy. Quote, in particular, since the great progress which has been made by natural science in this time, bracket, the 19th Iring Fetscher, end bracket, century, we are able more and more to get to know and therefore control even the most remote natural after effects of at least our more common productive activities. However, the more this is done, the more men will not only feel themselves to be of one with nature, but know that they are so united, and the more impossible will become that contradictory and anti-natural idea of an opposition between spirit and matter, man and nature, soul and body, which has arisen since the decline of classical antiquity in Europe and has found its highest expression in Christianity. End quote. Engels. Whereas by altering the means of production, Marx sought. Whereas by altering the means of production, Marx sought to change the mode of unity between the members of society and the relationship to nature, so that they would experience each other and nature as the beneficial completion of and condition for the development of their own lives. Engels stresses, especially in his later works, the progress of natural knowledge and technical command of nature. This is only a subordinate, if necessary, element in Marx's thought, and becomes the central point of interest in Engels. Later, Soviet Marxism emphasizes this shift even more strongly. Progress becomes identical with scientific technical progress, and the advantage of the, quote, socialist order of society, end quote, is seen in the last resort to be primarily that it guarantees optimal conditions for the development of the productive forces. Stalin, end parenthesis. Hence, religion and the church are now seen chiefly as obstacles to the full development of scientific research, and the old atheistic movement of godlessness lives on in a, quote, society for the propagation of scientific knowledge, end quote. A book by the SED, East German Socialist Unity Party ideologist Olaf Klur, contains the following logical conclusions. Quote, the following logical conclusion, quote, the, quote, conflict between natural science and religion, between the scientific and biblical Weltanschauung, is inescapably written into the historical sequence of events, and, in the interest of the development of socialism, cannot be ignored, since there can be no peaceful coexistence of these ideologies, end quote. German Wikipedia says, Olaf Klur, who lived from 1927 to 1994, was a German Marxist philosopher and university professor in the GDR. It says that Klur studied atheism and especially Catholicism, such as Teilhard de Chardin, as well as the sociology of religion. In GDR philosophy, the position became increasingly isolated from around 1969, as the SED leadership wanted to avoid conflict with the Protestant Church on the road to socialism. The atheism researcher Martin Roba, for example, shifted his interest to Oriental studies. Atheism was a central theme in Soviet philosophy. In the 1980s, Olaf Klur was involved in the preparation of the Eichsfeld study on Catholicism there. Stefan Heim ironically portrays Klur in the novel Ahasver as Dr. H.C. Bifus. Klur's books include Natural Science, Religion, and Church, an edited volume, Modern Natural Science and Atheism, edited volume, Religion and Atheism Today, Results and Tasks of Marxist Sociology of Religion, Marxism, Leninism, Atheism, Religion, on some problems of ideological atheistic education, expertise, and the Catholic Church in the Eichsfeld, a documentation. So, that's who Olaf Klur is. Anyway, back to the text. The misunderstandings behind this new position concern the nature of religion and that of science. The misunderstandings behind this new position can be traced in part to the relationship still unclarified between Hegel's, Marx's, and Engels and modern positivist notions of science. It can scarcely be denied that, at least in Marx's and to some extent in Engels' notion of science, consciously or unconsciously, there is still something of Hegel's comprehensive and absolute concept of science. In Marx, the place of, quote, absolute knowledge, end quote, is taken by historically conditioned absolute history, which becomes self-conscious in proletarian revolutionary action. In Engels, we find the outline of an absolute intendency and all-embracing dialectical materialist Weltanschauung, which in a manner similar to the Hegelian system could be understood as the self-awareness of the world in man, instead of the Hegelian spirit which materializes itself in the material world. But this type of science is not identical with the insight verifiable by experiment or observation into causal relationships between the phenomena of nature and society offered by modern science. Whereas the older philosophical type of, quote, science, end quote, seeks at the same time to clarify the whole of reality and the purpose of human existence, quote, science, end quote, in the modern positivist sense is able only to strengthen man's power over nature and social processes. By detecting causal or functional relationships, modern science therefore cannot come into conflict with religion, if modern science continues to operate within its self-imposed limits of research into verifiable relationships between individual isolated phenomena. With Lenin, the Marxist critique of religion assumes a sharply polemical tone which can scarcely be explained other than by personal psychological factors. Quote, religion is opium for the people. Opium for the people. Religion is a kind of spiritual gin in which the slaves of capital drown their human features and their claim to an even half-human existence, end quote. Lenin. The slight alteration which Marx's own, quote, religion is the opium of the people, end quote, has undergone here is significant. In Marx, it was a question of a narcotic with which the people in their misery create for themselves and which arises from the real misery of their situation. In Lenin, on the other hand, it becomes entirely in the sense of the older 18th century bourgeois critique of religion, which Lenin admired greatly, a soporific, deliberately compounded by the ruling classes for their servants, the people, in order to induce, quote, humility and patience in this earthly life, end quote. For the politician Lenin, religion is in the first instance, indeed almost exclusively, an instrument of domination. Quote, Marxism considers all modern religions and churches, each and every religious organization in all cases, as organs of bourgeois reaction which protect exploitation and serve to befuddle the working class, end quote. Lenin. In spite of this political instrumental concept of the function of religion, the tactician Lenin still repeatedly emphasized that, quote, the atheistic propaganda of social democracy must be subordinated to its main task, the development of the class struggle of the exploited masses against the exploiters, end quote. Lenin. Accordingly, the party leaders must make allowance for the religious prejudices of the workers if they will help to win them over for common action, such as a strike. In this tactical advice, there is still something of the older Marxist conception, according to which religion, quote, withers away, end quote, when a socialist and finally communist social order has been created by the common efforts of the revolutionary proletariat of the industrial nations. Lenin's polemic reaches its climax in his letters to Maxim Gorky, who was a member of an unattached religious group which called itself the, quote, Formers of God, end quote. Quote, precisely because any religious idea, any idea of any God, is an unspeakable abomination, taken up by the democratic bourgeoisie with a special tolerance, often even with sympathy, is the most dangerous abomination, the most abominable scourge. Millions of sins, vulgarities, acts of violence, and physical diseases are detected much more easily by the masses, and are therefore much less dangerous than the refined, intellectualized idea of a loving God, cloaked in resplendent, quote, ideological, end quote, garments, end quote. Lenin. November 1913. Insofar as this passionate hatred of every form of religion cannot be explained in terms of Lenin's own psychological makeup, it may be traced, particularly in this instance quoted above, to his anger that religion does not always coincide with the coarse and distorted cliché perpetuated by the 18th century bourgeois criticism of religion, which Lenin recommended as tactically useful for the backward conditions of Russia. This explains the sharp tone of his letters to the entirely unorthodox Maxim Gorky, whose literary work Lenin both admired and valued. Final section, conclusions. It seems to me that two conclusions may be drawn from this outline of the development of the Marxist critique of religion. 1. Marx's thesis that religion always arises from social conditions in which man is a miserable and servile being in which the individual cannot fathom may be countered by the Christian answer, all right, let us make a, quote, wager, end quote, in Pascal's sense. We know that religion is something other than a mere consequence of human misery and an inadequate understanding of social relationships. But if you are convinced that things are different, then prove that religion will wither away of religion's own accord. When optimum, or, quote, ideal, end quote, social conditions are created in which all men can lead happy lives. But in this case, you must not lessen the credibility of this empirical demonstration by using all possible kinds of social and political pressure against the faithful in their church. The church will not oppose any effort to establish truly just and free conditions of life. On the contrary, it will also refrain from political comment when it believes that a country is on the wrong path, as long as it remains at least credible that the government is acting in good faith. But the church may also expect that its own political reserve will be matched by equal reserve on the other side. Two, contemporary theology and scientific theory can put forward convincing arguments against the later Marxist critique of religion. They can show that how Christian faith is in no way bound to a medieval Weltanschauung, that modern theology no longer sets limits to scientific research, but simply expresses its concern at any unscrupulous application of natural scientific knowledge, doing so purely in the interest of the individual and his personal dignity. At the same time, the mode of scientific understanding of almost all leading contemporary scientists is such that they clearly recognize that science is hardly able to answer questions about the meaning of human existence, the value of life, and our moral tasks. In both cases, it seems to me that the modern Christian theology and faith which are open to the world have nothing to fear. When the inappropriate fears are overcome, it will be possible to achieve a relaxed, confident, and more humane relationship with communists. That's the end of this chapter, which was titled Changes in the Marxist Critique of Religion. Thanks for listening. The next chapter is called A Critique of the Soviet Marxist Concept of Fascism.